Welcome to Television as Furniture. Once again, we're doing another interview with an incredibly interesting artist, Jeremy Goldstein, who is presenting Truth to Power Cafe as part of this year's Melbourne Fringe in a digital season. Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. Okay, so the Truth to Power Cafe, which is presented by London Artists Projects, I should say, caught my eye because I was really interested not only in the content and the idea of the project, but also the twinning of the project with London and Nunawading. So maybe tell us a little bit about the project to begin with, and then we'll get into some more detail of the background of it, because there's some really fascinating backstory for it as well.
I mean, at the time I was working as a theatre producer in London, and I was really ready to make a life change. Like, I wanted to sort of do something. I wanted to sort of evolve and move on from that. And when my dad died, I mean, he left me with all sorts of questions and so on. So I just started to, I really entered into this kind of rigorous inquiry where I started to find out what had really gone wrong between my father and I. And in doing so, I learned a lot about him and his history and his friendships and so on. And by doing that, I learned a lot about myself as well. And see, my dad grew up with a very famous English playwright, Harold Pinter, who won the Nobel Prize in 2005. And they met each other just after the war in 1947. They became great friends in the 1950s. They became known as the Hackney Gang. And my father, Mick, was the source for a number of Pinter characters. And they remained lifelong friends. And for 60 years, they maintain their belief in speaking truth to power, and also remain firmly on the side of the occupied and the disempowered. And I guess the project sort of emerged from those sort of lifelong relationships and friendships which my father had between Harold and the gang. And I mean, I remember when I started working on it, I mean, they just before Dad died, there was a whole series of letters that had been acquired by the British Library in London, which formed part of the Harold Pinter archive. So I went into the archive, and all the letters are now on public record. So I was reading them. I was learning about, you know, their relationship. My father, as he was as a young man in the 1950s, of course, we never really know our parents when they're that age. And I learned a lot about him. I learned a lot about myself. And then I remember I sort of came up with the idea for the question, who has power over you and what do you want to say to them? Because that's the question which sort of sits at the heart of the work. And we ask all the participants taking part in the project the same question. I thought that would make a really interesting premise for a theatre show. And then when I started to think about that in the context of Harold, the Hackney Gang, and my father, and so on, it was just really sort of joining the dots, and that's how we sort of ended up with the show as it is today.
Yeah. That notion of speaking truth to power that's in the Truth to Power Cafe, of course, really resonates for me with those kind of early days of the Hackney Gang, where they'd sit around in cafes, etc., and argue and talk. And there's something about the way, not that I've seen it yet, but from what I have seen, there's something about the way that Truth to Power Cafe is structured that feels like that kind of argument, like that kind of lots of different voices and lots of different people speaking their truth and talking about power and how it's applied. Can you tell us a little bit about how the show itself works and what people can expect from it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, normally when we're doing the live show, it's a 60-minute theatre event during which we invite participants from within communities that we're working in to respond to the question. Their responses sit at the heart of the show, and every time we do the performance, there are different participants within the work. So every time we perform it, it really feels like a very authentic reflection of time, place, and community. The constants which sort of bind the participants' stories together are my own monologues, which bookend the participants' contributions. So the show opens with a 20-minute monologue, which I perform with. It's made up of music and poetry and image and memoir. I'm also cast in the show as a participant. So I'm speaking of the power my father had over me when he was alive, and why that was, and the impact that his friendship on Pinter had on me. So in that sort of opening monologue, I'm also really trying to set the stage for the participants to come up and speak from the truth of their lived experience in part two. And then we normally have maybe 8 to 10 people taking part in the show. And then after everybody has said their piece, the stage comes back to me and I perform the final poem. You've got to slide between the living and the dead. Open up that window in your head. Take the world and shake it. Crush it and remake it. Open up that window in your head. So the final poem is underscored by this terrific arrangement I have of David Bowie's Heroes. And then the finale, after we've done the poem, is the participants' photo portraits appear on the big screen. And there's a catharsis which happens in the space. What tends to happen is that our audiences tend to be made up of the participants' allies and friends and family and so on. So they start looking upon the people on stage, us as the participants, as kind of everyday heroes. So when they're looking back at their portraits at the end of the show, the participants become heroes in the eyes of the audience.
That's gorgeous. The poetry you mentioned, one of the people who's worked with you on this project, I believe, is Henry Wolfe, who was one of the other Hackney Gang.
Yeah,
is the poetry his?
Yeah, of course. I mean, lovely Henry. I mean, Henry was just a huge part in making this project, because as I was going into the British Library in 15-16 at the 2015, Henry was living around the corner from me in Belsize Park. So I was meeting up with him. We were, doing breakfast together, in this cafe in Belsize Park. He was telling me all about the gang and so on. I was going into the library reading the letters, and he started writing poetry in response to our conversations, and to the letters which I was talking to him about in the letters I was reading in the library. So the poetry was written, I suppose, in response to the project. I have to say, when it was written, we didn't even know we were going to be doing Truth to Power Cafe. So the project had a very organic development. It just, we had the poetry, and as we started creating the show, making it, we decided, wouldn't it be interesting if we used Henry's poetry in the piece as part of my monologue? And then from there, I was able to create this character. I've become the son of the Hackney Gang. So that's who I perform my monologue. That's the perspective from where I perform my monologue from, and it's all illustrated by Henry's poetry. So it comes from a really deeply authentic place. And of course, and then by the time, we get to the participants, I think you're so right, like in making that comparison to the way that the gang, would have talked to one another in the 50s and cafes and so on. I mean, these are the stories of the participants. Not only are they the stories which I really want to see on our stages, but they're also they're just very real, authentic representations of people speaking from the truth of their lived experience. And you know, when I think of the gang, you know, back in 1950s, I mean, it would not be dissimilar to like, I mean, I think of them in London, you know, in East London, you know, at the Arcola Theatre, or I don't know what the equivalent would be in Melbourne, and maybe the Malthouse or something. I mean, you know, you'd have kind of young people going to see shows in the theatres and then talking about it in cafes after. I mean, it would be a very similar, I guess, very similar experience to the conversations that they had in the 1950s. I suppose the big difference, I mean, we're all in a sort of state of crisis now. I mean, that's, you know, we're all in lockdown and sort of dealing with all of that. But in the 50s, you know, in London, it was, you know, they were still living in the shadow of the Holocaust, and the bombs which had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and so on. So, you know, so I suppose, you know, they were just living in really turbulent times, probably not dissimilar to where we are now.
I should ask, how are you doing with lockdown?
Well, you know, it's a bitch, really, isn't it?
Isn't it? You're in Sydney at the moment, I think?
I'm in Sydney, yeah, I'm in Sydney. But, you know, it's funny, like, making this project, like, in some respects, I feel like COVID has really been the making of us, because I remember, last March, you know, I was in London, you know, because I normally live in London. And anyway, the COVID sort of came up. Suddenly, you know, we saw an entire year's worth of dates during just fallout, you know, nothing left. And it was really a question of, we had to sink or swim. So it was at that moment that I took the project online. It became a digital platform as well as a live performance. And what we're showing in Melbourne Fringe is a new edition of our digital theatre adaptation, which we co-created with the community at Montgomery College Cultural Arts Centre in America last October. We filmed all my monologues in Conway Hall in London. That was all done in last August in a tiny window we had, you know, during lockdown. It was like 4 days in the space. Come on, quickly, let's get it done. We don't know if we're going to be able to finish it, but we're going to try anyway, and we did. And then we recorded all our participants from Montgomery College in October. And because the context for it was really fascinating, because it was all done in the run up to the US elections. And so we were able to cast participants within a 10-mile radius to the White House. And this streamed, it streamed from the US at the end of October, and then it was in London and then in Singapore. And now what we've been able to do with Bunjil Place is that I've been able to recreate the piece, you know, as a new edit of my monologues, and we've shot all the participants live on location in this fabulous kind of 800-seat state-of-the-art theatre at Bunjil Place in Narre Warren.
Amazing. How did you make the connection with? So Narre Warren, Nunawading, they're not the most let's say international of cities in Melbourne. How did you make the connection with them?
Oh, it came through Daniel Clark, who at the time was running, I think he was at Art Centre. No, actually I met him in Queensland. He was running at the art QPAC, that's right. And I was talking to him about the project, and he said, "Oh, you should talk to Joel Evans, who was programming at Bunjil Place." This was a couple of years ago now, and I did what he said, thanks to Daniel, and Joel got on board with the project, and it took about 2 years to set up. I mean, originally we were going to be there doing the live shows, you know, in their studio space, and then of course, you know, COVID came up again, and they said, "Look, we don't really think this is going to be possible, but would you be interested in doing it digitally?" And having had that experience of doing Montgomery College last year in America, I mean, I really leapt at the chance because we had to film all the participants in America over Zoom, and I just felt like kind of limited as a medium. It's not, you know, you can't really, there's only so much you can do with it. But when the Bunjil Place offer came up to make it digitally, I knew that like having people in that theatre and in that space would, you know, be a very different experience, not only for us making it, but also for our audiences. And so, you know, we ended up working with 30 participants live on their main stage, you know, in this great 800-seat theatre. And then we recorded about 10 stories from participants in their studio space.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that Dan Clark's behind that. He's that kind of guy. The other thing I was going to ask was, in the bit of research I did about it before talking to you, I came across your other piece that you've been working on or performing as well, which is the kind of companion piece, which is Spider Love. Are we going to get a chance to see that, or is that locked away somewhere?
God, I hope so. No, I mean this whole project is like a really long-term piece of work, and Spider Love is the sort of next stage within the development of the work. I mean, in fact, Truth to Power Cafe emerged from all the research we were doing on Spider Love. And Spider Love was actually an original play which was written by my father in the 1970s.
Will's Friends, I think, yeah?
Will's Friend, that's right. It was originally called Will's Friend. And it was one of the great finds that I came across when I was going through his possessions and so on. And when I read it, this was maybe a few years ago now. It was when it was going into the library and reading the letters and meeting up with Henry. We also had this play, and when I read it, I realised that it was my father coming to terms with his friendship with Harold and what it was like for him to be written into Harold's one and only novel, The Dwarfs. And the protagonist in that novel, Len, is based on my father, Mick. The play it's all sort of set on it opens on Remembrance Day 1975 with the sacking of Gough Whitlam and so on. It's all set in Melbourne, and it starts at the point where he has just seen himself portrayed on stage in a production of The Dwarfs in the early 70s. And then there's this sort of narcissistic relationship that he has with the young actor who plays him in the Melbourne production that he saw in the 70s. So it's sort of very meta. So that it's like a play going on inside a play. Eventually what I'd love to do with it, I really want to tour Spider Love with Truth to Power Cafe and show them in rep. And by doing that, we would take our community participants appearing in Truth to Power Cafe and then extend our relationship with them so that they're appearing as a community chorus in Spider Love. Yeah, so it's sort of, I suppose it's a at the moment it's a I see them both works very much a duet. They really feed off one another. Yeah, no, I mean that's a long-term thing. We've done several workshops of it in England. It's been read. It's had public readings at the British Library. We did a reading of it at Brisbane Powerhouse. Our last workshop was in November 2019, and it was very well received, I have to say. And we were going to develop it more last year, but then COVID hit and we couldn't do it. But it's hopefully we can pick it up in 22.
Oh, I really hope so. I even wanted to see it already when I read about it, but now hearing you talk about it, I want to see it even more. Okay, so once again, I've well and truly gone past my 10-minute limit. So
that's fine.
So I'll say thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to seeing Truth to Power Cafe. And I encourage all of my handful of viewers that they should also tune in and see it themselves.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Robert. It's brilliant.
Thank you.